Thank you for coming out today. We wanted again to give you an opportunity to speak with the briefers. So I'll go ahead, Mr. Prendergast. Go ahead and start.
Hi, I'm John Prendergast from the Enough Project and Century. Today we witnessed something I think very historic. I've spent 35 years of my career working on conflict, and for most of that time, corruption issues were not really acknowledged to be a driving force of conflict. Yet we understand very well, and I think many of the statements of the permanent representatives today illustrated, corruption is at the root of conflict, and the Security Council is willing to take it on. Ambassador Haley is going to lead in that regard, and I think that this is a historic moment in some ways to see that now the most important international body working on international peace and security is recognizing this core driver of violence and conflict as central to the agenda for conflict resolution.
I want to ask you, please, may I? Sure. Yeah. You mentioned that you gave the Security Council some recommendations that corruption should be taken into consideration when sanctions are discussed in the Council. So how was the feedback? Did you get any feedback from Council members? And I would like also to hear from Ambassador Haley about her position on this point. Thank you.
First. Yeah, I was very encouraged by the statements by a number of the country delegations, the willingness to look at corruption as a core driver of violence, and therefore, when using the points of leverage that the United Nations Security Council possesses in the form of targeted sanctions, to use corruption as a potential rationale for the imposition of those sanctions. So I think it's very encouraging today. It's going to require a lot of follow-up, but I do think that some of the country delegations made it clear that they were going to be utilizing that factor as part and parcel of their calculations going forward.
I think the main thing that I'll say is we have really tried to break the mold of the Security Council. The Security Council, when we came in 2 years ago, had their ideas of what was involved in peace and security. And it was the ideas that were comfortable to them. Since then, in the first presidency, we made them address human rights, and they pushed back and said that was a Geneva problem. It wasn't a New York problem. We think that's a problem everywhere, and if we're ever going to talk about peace and security, human rights have to be a part of that conversation. In this presidency, we said that you have to talk about corruption. We did get pushback, and you heard some of that in the council from those that don't think we need to talk about corruption. What I can tell you is whenever we get pushback from the council on any issue, it's all the more reason why we need to talk about it, because it's something that's being thrown under the rug. It's something that's not being talked about, and at the heart of what we're supposed to be doing in the Security Council is prevention. And so we'll continue to bring up those topics that we see that are being whispered about in closed doors, that are being talked about in hallways, but not being talked about in the chamber. And I think today was a big day in terms of opening up the conversation of corruption as it relates to peace and security. And that goes into what we're going to be hearing this afternoon. We have Assistant Secretary Billingsley here, who I will just tell you, Treasury could not be a better partner to us here at USUN in the way that we have really gone after corrupt regimes, those that are hurting their own people, the things that they are doing. Treasury has really come alongside us, and we've worked together to make a difference on the ground. And so we will be talking about Venezuela today. That's very important. And so I'm going to turn it over to Assistant Secretary Billingsley. Excuse me.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here as the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury at the Ambassador's invitation. It's also great to be here with John, who's a close partner, and we really value the relationship we have with your organization and other NGOs working on this most challenging and most heart-wrenching of issues. John gave a series of recommendations to the Security Council today, which are very much in line with how the administration and the Treasury Department have already been operating, and we welcome the chance to explore further opportunities to engage in targeted financial sanctions, as the Ambassador mentioned, particularly going after the complete networks of those who are extorting or otherwise extracting wealth from the helpless Dan Gertler is a good example of how the Treasury Department will use the Global Magnitsky Act to hold those who are engaged in these types of unacceptable levels of corruption and human rights abuse accountable. Look forward to the conversation this afternoon where we will delve into great detail regarding one of the most horrific humanitarian crises emerging in our Western Hemisphere, and that is the case of Venezuela, where corruption clearly poses a direct threat to regional peace and stability. Ambassador, thank you.
Follow up, if I may. Do you
Ambassador Haley, on Venezuela, this weekend there were reports of meetings between U.S. officials and some people in the military in Venezuela to discuss plans to overthrow President Maduro. Were you aware of these, and do you have any comment on this type of plans?
It's not anything we're acknowledging. I mean, it's no surprise. Venezuela is going to continue to talk about as many things as they can to distract from what's happening on the ground. What we know is that over 1 million Venezuelans have left the border and continue to every single day. And we're going to continue to highlight the human rights abuses. We're going to continue to highlight the corruption that's happening in Venezuela. And we're going to continue to highlight how Maduro is at the core of this. He can distract in any way that he wants, but we are full speed ahead on standing strongly with the Venezuelan people. We'll continue to do that.
May I follow up? May I follow up, please? Do you mean that any case of corruption in any country should be brought to the international community to be dealt with, or the United States is going to deal with the issue unilaterally? If you may clarify this issue.
So no country is immune to corruption. And every country has to work every day to ensure that corruption doesn't infiltrate its society. But what we should be willing to do is, while we always respect sovereign rights and we will always support sovereign rights, we should not think that we can't talk about the fact when we see corruption hurting people on the ground. When we start to see the powerful getting more and more wealthy off of the powerless, and we start to see that there's frustration that's happening. We know frustration leads to protests, protests lead to conflict, conflict leads to the Security Council, and then we're all having to deal with it. What we're saying is, whether it's human rights, whether it's corruption, whether it's any of these issues, we have to get past to where we can't talk about it. That's what they tried to do with Venezuela last year. When I tried to bring Venezuela to the Security Council, they said we couldn't talk about it. What if we had talked about it? Where would we be today in Venezuela had we had that conversation? And that's what we're saying, is we can't whisper about these things anymore. We do have to be willing to have those conversations. Now I'm going to ask you to point your questions to the two gentlemen, and we'll take just maybe a couple more.
Hi. Thank you. Hi, thanks. I have two questions. The first one is specifically about sanctions. We know that you guys have presented a list of sanctions, especially individuals. You have mentioned those sanctions are targeted to the Maduro regime and those around him. Are we expecting more sanctions soon? And especially when it comes to oil, we know that right now the situation for a lot of Venezuelans are very dire, especially those in the region. And Ambassador, do you think that eventually we will see that this is a subject that will end up on the agenda of the Security Council, especially now that we have regional meetings about the situation in Venezuela, 2.3 million Venezuelans leaving, situations in Brazil where Venezuelans are being lynched because of individual situations? Are we going to eventually see that as a regional issue that is more than a sovereign issue in Venezuela that is affecting the peace and security of the Americas?
Sure. I'll try to address both the questions that we just heard. Look, it is always our goal to work collaboratively with the international community in every instance where that's possible. And we do that through a number of mechanisms, the United Nations being obviously a major one. But we also do it, as John was talking today about the importance of the Financial Action Task Force. We work jointly there to strengthen money laundering regimes, anti-money laundering regimes, and we're going to continue to do that. But when we have cases where individuals are affecting the integrity of the U.S. financial system, the Department of the Treasury will not hesitate to act by ourselves if need be. Now, in terms of Venezuela, I wouldn't want to prejudge or forecast any additional actions that may or may not be forthcoming. Rather, there are a number of countries and bodies, including the European Union, Panama, Canada, the United States, and others, who've already taken strong action to ensure that those regime insiders and cronies who surround Maduro are not able to benefit from the illegitimate proceeds that they've been generating, stealing from the oil industry. We'll talk today about how they're stealing now from the mining industry and the gold sector. We'll also talk about the horrific holding hostage of humanitarian assistance coming into the country through the CLAP program and how they steal from that as well. So these will be things that we're going to encourage the international community to work on and to shine a bright spotlight on.
And I'm going to ask John to come forward just to talk about the effectiveness of sanctions and when he's found them to be effective and what their use can be.
Now, I think given the topic today, the connections between corruption and conflict, what I found extraordinary in the last year is the escalation, slowly but surely, by the Treasury Department of sanctions that begin to slowly expand the people who are affected by those sanctions, who are underwriting the profiting from conflict, from violence in South Sudan, in Congo, two of the biggest issues in front of the Security Council today. When leaders like Salva Kiir and Joseph Kabila see that there is a slow, steady ratcheting up of that financial pressure, when they realize that, in fact, some of their key interlocutors, financial interlocutors who have been squirreling away millions, if not billions of dollars on their behalf for years on end, and suddenly the spotlight is being shined on that illicit financial flow, and it's beginning to be curtailed through the use of these financial instruments, tools of financial pressure. That begins to affect the calculations. That begins to affect President Kabila's calculations as to whether or not he ought to run again. That begins to affect the calculations of President Kiir on whether or not he ought to sign the peace deal that's in front of him right now and whether he ought to implement it. So steadily increasing that net that begins to go around all this illicit activity is one of the primary, if not the primary, points of leverage that the international community, the United Nations Security Council and its member states, as well as all the member states in the General Assembly, can undertake in order to support peace, to support human rights, and support good governance. The connection between well-implemented and expanding and accelerated targeted sanctions against networks and the shifting of the calculations of leaders on the ground who have benefited for years, if not decades, from wholesale theft of the natural resources of their country. The connection between those two things, to me, is very direct.
Thank you all very much. We'll see you all this afternoon.
All we have planned for the ICC, the sanctions